You are listening to Stranger Than Fiction, Corruption and Crimes Against Humanity in the COVID Era, an audiobook by N.B. Austin. This is a free audiobook, but if you enjoy what you're listening to, you'd like to cut ahead quicker, you'd like to have access to all the citations, it's also available in ebook and paperback on Amazon. Even if reading is not quite your thing and you prefer to listen, buying a copy is a great way to support and is much appreciated. Finally, be sure to like, subscribe, share with friends and family, and most importantly, if you do buy a book, leave a review on Amazon. All of the above help tremendously in getting this information out there and turning the tide on medical tyranny. Now, without further ado, let's begin with Chapter 4, Masks. Quote, "They've got a personal kind of agenda. They make up their own rules as they go, they change them when they want to, and they smugly, like Tony Fauci, does not mind going on television in front of the people who pay his salary and lie directly into the camera." End quote. Carrie Mullis on public health bureaucrats. Anthony Fauci was appointed director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, a unit of the NIH, in 1984. According to the Institute, over the course of his career, he has advised 7 presidents on a variety of public health issues. Fauci has also been in this position over the majority of the life of the CDC, an organization which has existed in some form since July 1st, 1946, for the nominal purpose of disease control and prevention. While for now we will focus on Fauci, the CDC and public health organizations all over the world have run in parallel, lockstep fashion during the COVID era. The year 2020 was the 36th year of Anthony Fauci's directorship in combating these types of infectious diseases. By this point in any person's career, one would think someone like Fauci would be well aware of a standard, basic set of actions which he would recommend people take during any pandemic. And in a pre-COVID, May 22, 2019 Bloomberg interview, it appeared he was. Quote, "Interviewer, and the best way for me to prevent getting an infectious disease and having to have you as my doctor is what? Wearing a mask?" Fauci, No. Interviewer, "If I can see they're getting ready to sneeze or cough, walk away?" Fauci, "You avoid all paranoid aspects and do something positive. A good diet. B, if you don't smoke. I know you don't drink, at least not very much, so that's pretty good. Get some exercise. I know you don't get as much exercise as you should. Get good sleep. I think the normal, low-tech, healthy things are the best thing that you can do, David, to stay healthy." End quote. Unfortunately, though, once 2020 arrived, it seems Fauci second-guessed and reversed every single thing he'd known and previously recommended about the actions people should take during such an event. And masks, which above we can see he actually laughed at the notion of, were one major example. Quote, Fauci, "Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks." Interviewer, "You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this." Fauci, "No, right now people should not be, there's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often, there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask, and they keep touching their face." Interviewer, "And you can get some sort of schmutz sort of staying inside there?" Fauci, Of course. But when you think masks, you should think of healthcare providers needing them and people who are ill." End quote. Anthony Fauci, March 8th, 2020. Quote, "I wear it for the reason that I believe it is effective. It's not 100% effective. It's sort of respect for another person and have that other person respect you. You wear a mask, they wear a mask, you protect each other. I mean, I do it when I'm in the public for the reasons that A, I want to protect myself and protect others, and also because I want to make it be for people to see that that's the kind of thing that you should be doing." End quote. Anthony Fauci, May 27, 2020. Quote, "You're using the word mandating masks. Yes, if that works, let's do it. I don't think it's going to happen nationally. If it doesn't happen nationally, the reason is because it may not come from the White House to do it. If it doesn't, then I think that the mayors and the governors should do it." End quote. Anthony Fauci, October 2020. Quote, So if you have a physical covering with one layer, you put another layer on. It just makes common sense that it likely would be more effective, and that's the reason why you see people either double masking or doing a version of an N95. End quote. Anthony Fauci, January 25th, 2021. Quote, "It is conceivable that as we go on a year or two more from now, that during certain seasonal periods when you have respiratory-borne viruses like the flu, people might actually elect to wear masks to diminish the likelihood you'll spread these respiratory-borne diseases." End quote. Anthony Fauci, May 9th, 2021. For anyone else in such a leadership position during trying times, this would be viewed as a complete failure, no matter which position a person takes on masks. For example, if you believe they work, Fauci failed to recognize them right off the bat as a standard practice. In fact, with Fauci eventually suggesting masks should be a permanent, if seasonal, garment for cold and flu prevention too, one has to wonder why he was laughing off the notion of wearing them at all in 2019. If, on the other hand, you agree with Fauci's opinion during the first 36 years of his career, namely that masks are counterintuitive, then he obviously failed in even grander fashion by reversing course on all of his positive recommendations. Despite this obviously dishonest failure from all perspectives, however, Fauci has been incessantly propagandized as a kind of untouchable high priest. More on that later. And since, as we can see in the quotes above, Fauci is clearly the opposite of, quote, the only one saying facts, as he claims to be, we will take it upon ourselves next to actually make sense of the history and differing perspectives people have on masks. Bacteria, chemicals, and other things to not inhale. In 2008, the NIH published a paper co-written by Anthony Fauci in which it claimed the, quote, majority of deaths during the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919 were not caused by the influenza virus acting alone. Instead, most victims succumbed to bacterial pneumonia following influenza virus infection. End quote. According to Fauci himself, quote, bacteria delivered the knockout punch. Also, per the CDC, quote, a common cause of bacterial pneumonia is the bacteria Streptococcus pneumoniae. End quote. So with these two public health opinions in mind, we turn to a story about a group of parents in Florida who sent their kids' face masks to a lab for analysis. The analysis of the mask detected Streptococcus pneumoniae, among many other germs associated with a variety of illnesses. This analysis was also confirmed by the experiments of mask-wearing proponents. According to local news station WDBJ7, their team took a trip to Virginia Maryland College of Veterinary Medicine to test, quote, how many bacteria are trapped by masks. Alongside two scientists, Director of Facilities Peter Jobst and Department Head of Biomedical Sciences and Pathology Margie Lee, the team coughed into petri dishes with and without masks. After 2 days, they then checked the dishes for bacteria growth. Predictably, they found the unmasked petri dishes to contain bacteria growth, with none in the mask-covered dishes. However, this experiment was ended here with no mention of viral transfer, the intended purpose of mask wearing in the COVID era, and the conclusion that the masks work because they trapped the spread of bacteria. Why didn't the scientists check to see how much bacteria was trapped and growing on the inside of the mask? Why didn't they wonder whether or not it was a good thing to trap exhaled bacteria right before one's mouth, only to be continuously re-inhaled? The otherwise inexplicable questions of how and why such willful incompetence and/or deceit took place will be addressed at length later in this book. But the reality is the harmful effects of mask wearing have been known since the year of the 1918 Spanish flu itself, when newspaper headlines such as that from the Santa Barbara Daily News read, quote, mask is chief ally of flu, physicians declare. Average person doesn't know how to take care of mask and it becomes veritable bacteria incubator, end quote. So, when taking the words of the NIH that the, quote, majority of deaths during the Spanish flu were ultimately delivered by bacterial pneumonia, alongside these logical observations and additional studies that masks build up bacteria like Streptococcus pneumoniae, as well as doctors who directly affirm the connection between masks and bacterial pneumonia, it becomes clear that masking is a completely counterintuitive measure to take to prevent death and should have been identified as such from the beginning of the COVID era. Bacterial buildup is also confirmed as medical professionals cited as the cause of several other unintended embarrassing consequences of masking. Miranda Mellos, for example, a registered nurse in a Level 2 trauma center emergency department, said, quote, "When you are breathing out in a mask, the bacteria from your mouth gets trapped. Without proper hygiene, which is essentially guaranteed for implementing and mandating a new practice billions worldwide are untrained in, masks are therefore admitted by Mellos to cause acne breakouts, bad breath, tooth decay, gum inflammation, rashes, and even contraction of the illnesses they are intended to prevent." The case against wearing a mask over your mouth is also made increasingly dire when considering the materials a face mask is comprised of. For example, evidence has been gathered by scientists that masks which are on sale and being used by members of the general public are laced with toxic, cancer-causing chemicals and don't necessarily meet safety standards. These compounds include formaldehyde, a chemical known to cause watery eyes, burning in the eyes, nose and throat, coughing, wheezing, and nausea; aniline, a known carcinogen which is considered both a health and environmental hazard; cobalt, a known carcinogen which can cause a variety of health complications; hazardous fluorocarbons; optical brighteners, a chemical considered to cause environmental hazard with some ties to allergy aggravation; 2-butanone oxime, a known carcinogen; acetaldehyde, a probable carcinogen which can cause a variety of health issues; and microfibers. Mid to long-term mask use, longer than a single use, quote, promotes both fiber abrasion and encourages bacterial colonization over time. Tests find that microfiber abrasion in some masks can be classified as, quote, hazardous dust by German social accident insurance. The danger of these chemicals is exacerbated by the focus on mandating the use of masks and the complete lack of any effort by public health organizations to caveat the risks of improper use, which we have demonstrated to this point are many. For example, a common argument might be that surgeons and doctors wear masks. However, this does not address the following. First, no surgeon or doctor ever thought it was useful to continue wearing their mask in their daily life before, despite ever-present cold and flu. If there were no negative consequences to mask wearing at all, why would they not have done this their whole lives? What would have been the harm? 2. Surgeons in particular, but also doctors, do not always wear masks on the job. The primary time they wear masks is when and because they're around open wounds and can be subject to bodily secretions. The usefulness in this situation is to prevent contamination and infection of a wound via the primary source of projectile while a surgeon works, the nose and mouth. After such a surgery, a mask would then be discarded. Third, surgeons and doctors do not, for the safety reasons mentioned above, re-wear masks, nor do they wear a single-use mask long-term. Mandating of indefinite mask use encourages the exact opposite behavior. And fourth, mass single-use masking is neither a viable or desirable practice, as even at current mid to long-term use practices, an estimated 1.5 billion face masks have entered oceans in 2020 per Oceans Asia. While on a recent vacation in Charleston, South Carolina, I even personally witnessed at least 5 separate masks laying in the road on a single city block. The psychology of masks. What we've named so far are only the physical dangers associated with masks. There are also a variety of psychological issues masks are known to cause. The following studies and citations demonstrate this psychological impact. Per a 2020 study by Vander Westhuizen et al. In the BMJ, face masking, quote, can provoke an increase in stress hormones with a negative impact on immune resilience in the long term. Face masking prevents the mirroring of facial expressions, a process that facilitates empathetic connections and trust between pupils and teachers. This lack of mirroring potentially leads to a significant increase in socio-psychological stress. Several studies show that long-term exposure to socio-psychological stress leaves neuroepigenetic scars that are difficult to cure in young people and often escalate into mental behavioral problems and a weakened immune system. End quote. And given the objective of mask wearing is to prevent respiratory illness, the practice is revealed to be increasingly counterintuitive as researchers show a, quote, relationship between the increase in stress experiences and the risk of upper respiratory tract infections and mortality, end quote. This being done, again, to an age bracket of approximately 100 million in the U.S., which experienced 412 deaths total attributed to COVID in a year and 8 months. Per the Organization for Autism Research, autistic children face particularly significant problems with mask wearing. Despite these problems, which are both mental and physiological, public health organizations have failed to take a stand in defense of even this most obvious of exceptional cases. As a result, parents of autistic children in the COVID era have seen their doctors deny them exemption forms for their children, who have been inhumanely kicked out of school, airplanes, and stores as a result. Per a 2020 study by Dyer in the BMJ, prisoners at Guantanamo Bay were shown in photos to have been subject to torture tactics, which included wearing surgical masks. According to Dr. Duncan Forrest of UK-based charity the Medical Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture, tactics such as this constitute sensory deprivation, quote, bordering on torture, which could cause immediate and lasting psychological symptoms akin to post-traumatic stress disorder, end quote. Per retired Lieutenant Colonel and best-selling author Dave Grossman, masks are used in wartime to create a sense of anonymity for an aggressor, while dehumanizing the victim. In his experience, they prevent empathy, empower violence, and lead to violence. Jacqueline Teague, clinical director at the Speech and Learning Institute, reported a, quote, 364% increase in patient referrals of babies and toddlers who were speech delayed during the COVID era. According to Teague, masks are, quote, most definitely a factor due to the inability of the child to observe the masked adult's face, which is necessary to help them pick up on speech patterns. This demographic increased from 5% of her patient population pre-COVID to 20% during the COVID era. As seen in these examples, perhaps the most inhumane cowardice surrounding mask mandates has come from the masking of children. Several politicians, including New York Governor Kathy Hochul and Georgia political figure Stacey Abrams, took disgusting public relations photos in classrooms, smiling maskless in rooms full of masked children. The psychological abuse associated with these political stunts represents an unconscionable attack on an entire generation, many of whom will suffer mental consequences for the rest of their lives. And even at a young age, some of them are already well aware of the atrocity which has been committed against them. One brave 8-year-old girl in Florida, for example, was suspended 38 times for exercising her right to not have her breathing hole covered and spoke up to the vile cowards on her school board for this injustice. Another 10-year-old boy made an impassioned plea about the absurdity of being forced to wear a mask while, quote, outside at PE, physical education, and on track. These are two among several other examples of children who will not otherwise be remembered for it, but did, in fact, demonstrate heroic courage during a time their elders were willing to condemn them to an evil fate. And make no mistake about it, I use the word absurd frequently, but this was not done out of mere stupidity. This was cowardice, this was greed, as we will later prove, and this was evil. Those defining traits were reflected well in the sarcastic words of one Illinois student who rightfully ridiculed the betrayal her school board committed on her and her fellow students as follows. Quote, thank you for teaching students that our own mental health is much less important than making triple vaccinated adults feel safe. Thank you for teaching me that even the most minute risk is not worth taking. Life is best when you take the path of least resistance with no chance of failure and definitely no chance of catching a cold. Thank you for not reaching out to the students to see how we feel about masks, because if you did, the majority of students would say that they hate masks, and then you might second-guess your decision to make us wear them. Thank you for allowing me to experience the anxiety of never seeing facial expressions. Thank you for teaching us that we should never question authority or think critically, but instead we should follow whatever the people in charge tell us to do. Obedience is best. I realize now that thinking for yourself is overrated, and not really necessary when you could just make decisions based on fear. Thank you for pushing your irrational anxieties and fears on me because I didn't already have enough to worry about. I realize now how easy it is when I only had to worry about my classes, my grades, the SAT, and getting into college. Thank you for teaching me that being a morally superior person only requires that I cover my face for 8 hours a day, and that the most morally superior people wear 2 masks or even 3 masks. As you know, states around us, Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, and Minnesota, which have 2.5 times more students than Illinois, don't force kids to mask. I'm with you, though. These states are out of control, recklessly putting kids at the risk of misery and death every day. Masks work, even if these states have the same outcomes as Illinois. Speaking of data, thank you for staying silent about masking despite the fact that COVID has a very high survival rate in kids my age. Who needs data, though? We all know it will never be safe to see anyone's face ever again. End quote. I include this entire quote because these people deserve the most aggressive of ridicule. To go on a side tangent for a moment, It has been worse than infuriating to watch their irrational fear of death used as a justification to abuse those who chose not to live in fear. Instead of encouraging people to make their own decisions about risk tolerance and leaving the rest to fate, they cheered for state-enforced hypochondria on everyone else, no matter how little they could support their insane position. They screamed in people's mask-free faces, called for their discrimination at stores, including to eat, and worst of all, abused children. As someone who has stood opposed to this evil from the outset, it has taken everything in me to wish anything but vengeance upon these lost, child-abusing charlatans. But I know God will see to justice being done in the long run. And until then, or until those who did behave this way acknowledge their actions and apologize, I, for one, will continue to do everything in my power to ensure my family is not dependent on a single one of them for anything in the future. But I digress. Perhaps one of the most important long-term issues surrounding masks comes from German Dr. Marguerite Gries-Brisson, MD, PhD, who is a consultant neurologist and neurophysiologist with a PhD in neurotoxicity, environmental medicine, neuroregeneration, and neuroplasticity, and who is not alone among neurologists sounding the alarm on mask mandates. In a video posted to and subsequently inexplicably banned from YouTube in mid-2020, she stated her opinion as follows. Quote, "The reinhalation of our exhaled air will without a doubt create oxygen deficiency and a flood of carbon dioxide. We know that the human brain is very sensitive to oxygen deprivation. There are nerve cells, for example, in the hippocampus that can't be longer than 3 minutes without oxygen. They cannot survive. The acute warning symptoms are headaches, drowsiness, dizziness, issues in concentration, slowing down of reaction time, reactions of the cognitive system. However, when you have chronic oxygen deprivation, all of those symptoms disappear because you get used to it. But your efficiency will remain impaired and the undersupply of oxygen in your brain continues to progress. We know neurodegenerative diseases take years to decades to develop. If today you forget your phone number, the breakdown in your brain would have already started 20 or 30 years ago. The second problem is that the nerve cells in your brain are unable to divide themselves normally. So in case our governments will generously allow us to get rid of masks and go back to breathing oxygen freely again in a few months, the lost nerve cells will no longer be regenerated. What is gone is gone. There is no unfounded medical exemption from face masks because oxygen deprivation is very dangerous for every single brain. It must be a free decision of every human being whether they want to wear a mask." End quote. Dr. Gries-Brisson goes on to discuss how devastating masks will be for the long-term physiological development of children, another crime continuing to be forced upon an entire generation of completely riskless people on a daily basis, and how, quote, "oxygen deprivation damages every single organ in the body." In an almost comically insulting bit of the fact-checking propaganda we discussed earlier, fact-check site AFP cites, quote, "experts" in claiming Dr. Gries-Brisson has been, quote, "debunked." But not only did the professional liar who authored this blog post demonstrate the audacity to suggest the actual opinion of an actual doctor was, quote, "debunked," they even went as low, as immature, and as threatening as to show a picture of Dr. Gries-Brisson with a red X through it. Considering Dr. Gries-Brisson undeniably is an expert, the title of the blog post could just as easily be "Experts say wearing face masks causes neurological damage," and it still would ring true. In fact, if an actual journalist sought to do their job and not intentionally mislead their readers, they might title their blog post, "Experts disagree on whether face masks cause neurological damage." AFP, however, like we've seen with an endless supply of fact-checking blogs, does not fall into this category. Furthermore, to call what AFP did a debunking is equally silly. Again, AFP simply highlights a difference of opinion held by a physician named Philip Lepper. Imagine going for a second opinion at a doctor and calling the second opinion a fact check. That's what the AFP dishonestly does as a business model. In reality, Lepper's entire point is refuted in the AFP's own blog post when chief hospital physician Dominic Delweg says, quote, "The mask provides additional resistance for our breathing. Our respiratory muscles have to work harder to breathe air through the mask. It can be uncomfortable and even cause shortness of breath. This is not an expression of an insufficient supply of oxygen to the body. This increased exertion is reported to the brain as shortness of breath via receptors in the respiratory muscles, although the values of oxygen and carbon dioxide are in the normal range." End quote. The argument Delweg gives here to oppose the point of reduced oxygen is extremely strange. First of all, according to Mayo Clinic, one of the causes of hypoxemia, below normal levels of oxygen in the blood, is the inability of the lungs to inhale the oxygen-containing air. This is exactly the process Delweg describes when he says the, quote, respiratory muscles have to work harder to breathe the air through the mask. Perhaps what he means is that this struggle does not imply a lack of oxygen in the body, which is fair, considering a physically exerted person simply breathes more heavily to compensate for increased oxygen need. However, if a physically exerted person were to continue exercising for, say, 8 hours, their ability to continue getting the airflow they need, and thus the oxygen, would obviously worsen over time. Wearing a mask and further inhibiting the breathing process on an ongoing basis would serve as the same needless strain, which Delweg seems to agree with. And it is not denied whatsoever that masks increase the risk of such oxygen-inhibiting lung injuries, as even avid mask proponent The Health Site admits the dangers of exercising with a mask on and highlights a story about a misguided man whose lungs collapsed as a result of doing so. Scientific reasoning for why masks do not prevent anything. To go deeper on Lepper's points, AFP's resident expert presents a glaring issue with their own mask-favoring narrative when they explain how, quote, air flows freely through the mask. In making this claim, Lepper says that, quote, the pore size of medical mouth and nose masks is around 100,000 to 1 million times larger than an oxygen molecule. Therefore, he claims, it is impossible for the mask to prevent the flow of oxygen. So let's review the claim and understand its implications. According to the NIH, the pore size of masks ranges from 800 to 500 micrometers. We will assume Lepper's claim is true that an oxygen particle is 260 picometers, 0.00026 micrometers. In this case, he would be correct that oxygen particles are significantly smaller than mask pores, as there are 1 million picometers in a micrometer. However, if he is correct that this means there will be no stagnation of oxygen flow, this would also imply that wearing masks to stop viral transfer is pointless, since SARS-CoV-2 is claimed to range from 50 to 140 nanometers, 0.05 to 0.14 micrometers, also much smaller than mask pore size. To summarize, if Lepper is right, masks can't stop oxygen intake or viral transfer and are therefore pointless. If Lepper is wrong, on the other hand, masks could inhibit some degree of oxygen intake and viral transfer, which would cause more harm than good in human bodies, which need oxygen to prevent the host of issues previously mentioned, including respiratory illness. However, Stanford University researchers found N95 masks do actually reduce oxygen intake by anywhere from 5 to 20%. So this contradicts Lepper's point on oxygen stagnation being impossible, since N95 masks have a 0.1 to 0.3 micrometer pore size, still much larger than an oxygen molecule. A 50 to 20% reduction in oxygen over the long term is a surefire way to break down and destroy a human body. Still, after 2 years of violating human rights with cloth, surgical, and/or N95 mask mandates, N95 masks have become the official CDC pivot policy recommendation in 2020. This is because the futility of cloth and surgical masks has apparently been rediscovered, as they've been admitted as having been pointless, quote, facial decorations by Fauci and the same COVID collaborators who knew this to be true before the COVID era began. For why they would pretend otherwise, one need only look at Fauci's own words, namely that masks serve as a symbol. More on that later, though. Back to the fact-checkers, who all have the same exact opinion, narrative, on everything. Their commitment to their assigned cause consistently leads them into a pickle of their own fact-checking. You see, in a desperate effort to claim some masks still weren't dangerous, cloth and surgical, Snopes in May 2020 was forced to acknowledge Stanford's N95 affirmation that Dr. Griesbrisson was not, quote, debunked, as falsely claimed by fact-checker AFP. At the same time, AFP's, quote, fact-check expert opinion demonstrates in hilarious fashion how fact-checkers can fact-check the facts for fact-checkers to the point where you end up with a perverted version of what would otherwise be a healthy debate. Does the minuscule size of an oxygen particle mean inhibition is impossible in masks? Clearly, Snopes and AFP do not agree, and if they were honest, each would fact-check the other. It is also interesting to reflect on this May 2020 Snopes propaganda defending cloth and surgical mask mandates, now that they are admitted as having been, quote, facial decorations the entire time. Was what they said in 2020 a fact, or is what their masters are saying now a fact? To further expound on the lack of masking effectiveness, we can also look at the same type of epidemiological data we did in relation to lockdowns, which show clearly there was no benefit by location in mask mandates. Denmark, for example, has seen its public health officials openly shun mask mandates, who claimed, quote, all these countries recommending face masks haven't made their decisions based on new studies. Despite this approach, which the majority of public health organizations and media would deny and gaslight proponents of, Denmark has seen one of the lowest death rates per 100,000 of any recorded country at 0.45. Compare this to the rates of heavily restricted countries in our chapter on lockdowns for the eye-popping difference. At a case per population rate of 6%, Denmark is also well below many countries in that mark as well, the US being at 12.5%, the UK at 10.8%, and Israel at 13.1%, for example. The timeline of masking policy in the state of Texas is also a tremendous case study in the practice's complete futility. On July 2, 2020, for example, Governor Greg Abbott issued an executive order requiring face coverings in commercial settings. Despite this policy, however, case rates in Texas hovered within plus or minus 50% of the same 7-day average, about 6,000, seen on July 2nd for the second half of the year. That is, until December, when 7-day case rates skyrocketed to more than 4 times that of July 2nd, despite the mandates. By March 3, 2021, with 7-day average cases down to 7,000, Governor Abbott then removed the mask mandate. By July 2, 2021, 7-day case rates had dropped to 1.5 thousand, the lowest since June 2020. They then rose again by September to the same level seen in the December with mandate spike, demonstrating that mask policy has not correlated to case rates whatsoever in the state. To round out this chapter, we will now highlight some further studies and information which support our findings and show any perceived benefits of alleged viral transmission prevention by masks are highly debatable. Per a 2021 study by Kalinske et al. In the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, quote, we objectified evaluation evidence changes in respiratory physiology of mask wearers with significant correlation of oxygen drop and fatigue, a clustered co-occurrence of respiratory impairment and oxygen drop, N95 mask and carbon dioxide rise, N95 mask and oxygen drop, N95 mask and headache, respiratory impairment and temperature rise, but also temperature rise and moisture under the masks. Extended mask wearing by the general population could lead to relevant effects and consequences in many medical fields. End quote. Per the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, 6 trials have been published related to mask wearing over the past decade. These trials showed that, quote, masks alone have no significant effect in interrupting the spread of influenza-like illnesses in the general population nor in healthcare workers. A 2021 randomized controlled study by Bundgaard et al. In Annals of Internal Medicine found no statistically significant effect of surgical masks against SARS-CoV-2 in a community setting. Per the Washington Examiner, citing Jeffrey Anderson at City Journal, whether or not masks work depends on the study, with the best studies suggesting they don't. Anderson makes a key distinction between observational studies and randomized control studies, RCTs, noting that public health organizations have mostly based their policy on observational studies. The problem with such studies, however, is they do not include a control group. Anderson demonstrates the issue with this by comparing to an observational study about a non-mask-wearing gym trainer who coached 50 members during a time he tested positive, but not one member developed symptoms. Without a control group, the variable in question, in this case masks, cannot be truly tested. This principle is fundamental to properly conducting the scientific method, and Anderson highlights its use in the Danish study mentioned above. The CDC, however, based their guidance on an observational study following 200 hairdressers. This demonstrates the failure on the part of the organization to follow basic scientific best practices. But Anderson also demonstrates it is actually a choice born out of dishonesty when he points out the CDC's dismissal of the Danish study, which had 4,800 participants, as, quote, inconclusive and, quote, too small. It should go without saying that a study with more participants and a control group cannot possibly be too small or inconclusive relative to a study with less participants and no control group. Anderson goes on to conclude that, quote, in some of the 14 RCTs that have tested the effectiveness of masks in preventing the transmission of respiratory viruses, 3 suggest but do not provide any statistically significant evidence in intention to treat analysis that masks might be useful. The other 11 suggest that masks are either useless, whether compared with no masks or because they appear not to add to good hand hygiene alone, or actually counterproductive, end quote. Per a 2020 study by Klampas et al. In the New England Journal of Medicine, quote, we know that wearing a mask outside healthcare facilities offers little if any protection from infection, Public health authorities define a significant exposure to COVID-19 as face-to-face contact within 6 feet with a patient with symptomatic COVID-19 that is sustained for at least a few minutes, and some may say more than 10 minutes or even 30 minutes. The chance of catching COVID-19 from a passing interaction in a public space is therefore minimal. In many cases, the desire for widespread masking is a reflexive reaction to anxiety over the pandemic. End quote. A 2020 study by Bay et al. In Annals of Internal Medicine saw 4 infected patients cough into a petri dish with a mask on and found, quote, both surgical and cotton masks seem to be ineffective at preventing the dissemination of SARS-CoV-2 from the coughs of patients with COVID-19 to the environment and external face mask. A UK study reportedly showed children who never or sometimes wear masks at work or school were less likely to test positive than those who always wear them. A 2011 randomized clinical trial by McIntyre et al. In influenza and other respiratory viruses studied standard medical and surgical masks and demonstrated no protection at all from influenza. Per April 6, 2020, World Health Organization guidance on use of masks related to COVID-19, quote, wide use of masks by health people in the community setting is not supported by current evidence. Masking also comes with, quote, uncertainties and critical risks. These critical risks include, quote, a false sense of security, as well as, quote, touching the face under the mask and under the eyes. These risks would therefore result in, quote, unnecessary costs. The final point I will highlight on masks before closing out is this. The lack of common sense limitation on mask mandates and recommendations led to downright baffling anti-science clown show behavior in society throughout 2020 and 2021. For one, Bill Gates went unquestioned by a panel of his peers when he seriously compared wearing masks to wearing pants. This despite the fact that he was inexplicably not wearing a mask, but was wearing pants during the talk, and was notoriously known for not wearing masks at all, despite incessantly endorsing them throughout the COVID era. The following are just a few additional examples of absurd practices many fearful people tricked by this dishonesty took upon themselves. Neither the CDC, NIH, FDA, WHO, nor any other public health organization made any effort at all to convince them not to engage in these behaviors, despite their clearly pointless, counterintuitive, and widespread nature. In fact, on many occasions, those organizations encouraged them. These included requiring masks to walk from the host stand of a restaurant to the table and then not at all required during the meal, wearing masks alone in the car, wearing actual outer space type helmets. I personally witnessed someone doing this unironically. Wearing full-on gas masks. I personally witnessed this as well, though I can't know if it was or wasn't ironic. Kissing with masks on. Staring into each other's eyes from a distance as a substitute for kissing with masks on. Having sex with masks on. Wearing masks while working out. Wearing masks while running outside. Wearing masks while outside. Double and triple masking. Putting pantyhose on your head to make your mask safer. Yes, this really was an unironic thing the Vice blog posted about, even if it seems like a veiled attempt to mock people and test the extent of their gullibility. Oregon Governor Kate Brown also turned herself into a meme by sharing a selfie in a way-over-the-top holiday face covering. It featured thick, Christmas-colored frill and what appeared to resemble a snow globe attached to the front. Perhaps Brown was in the holiday spirit, but it'd be impossible to know considering her entire face was hidden other than her dead eyes. Based on all of the above information, the unintended consequences of masks are demonstrably worse than any possible benefit. Further, understanding that, quote, the science changes every day, mandated masking, along with any mandate based on what oligarchs call science for that matter, constitutes an informed consent violation and should be considered a crime against humanity. During the COVID era, people were forced via economic sanctions, discrimination, and other coercion into nonsensical action, which leads to physical health damage, psychological damage, environmental damage, free expression rights violations, religious violations, and bodily autonomy rights violations. The societal implications of this coercion have also been so damaging that merely breathing in someone else's presence has become erroneously perceived and literally used in court as a justification for lethal self-defense. Thanks to this, quote, symbol, the despicable lie was seeded into the subconscious of people all over the world that those around them, including their family and friends, were diseased and to be avoided. The fear of other human beings was then used on too many occasions to count in order to justify discrimination, harassment, assault, and battery. As we've shown, those who pushed that lie and caused that fear knew full well the damage doing so would result in. With the aims of normalizing the coming discrimination of the mass inoculation campaign we have yet to cover and breaking down resistance, they carried on anyway. And so we repeat the words of Kary Mullis, who in his own life experienced the same deceit by the same people so many years prior. Quote, "They have their own personal kind of agenda, they make up their own rules as they go, they change them when they want to."